So I'm Todd Leader. I'm the Vice President, and I'm acting as Lynn Brogan. Uh, and like I said, Lynn unfortunately was unable to make it, so I'll be facilitating this meeting. um, so I'll start with calling the meeting to order and um, and do our land acknowledgement. So all people in Canada have treaty rights and responsibilities. Those who have settler, arrivant, and refugee origins are challenged to collectively work towards reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and communities. Even as we reckon with our own profession's role in residential schools and other colonial projects designed to displace, dispossess, and disempower Indigenous peoples, social workers are also embedded in communities that are grappling with their own roles in the great and necessary labor of reconciliation. As many Canadian communities struggle through conflict and crisis, worsened by the intersections of pandemic, economic uncertainty, and racism, we encourage our members to approach this work with a trauma-informed lens, to draw on the resources available to you, and to ground your praxis in your professional values and ethics. We are confident in your desire to rise to these challenges and to help our communities do the same. Let us know how we can support you. So let's start off with the process. A few things. One, if you're not speaking, please make sure that your mic is off. If you are able to have your camera on, that would be great so people can see your face. Makes it a little bit more personal in this impersonal age. There are two motions and one resolution being discussed. I'll be calling on people to put forward the motion in each case. And after which I'll be looking for somebody to second the motion. And once it's seconded, then we'll be able to proceed to discussion of that motion. Alec and I will be facilitating that process. I would ask that you please use the option under the reactions to raise your hand, and we'll try and keep track and take people in order. When you're called upon, please make sure that your camera and your mic are on, because we would like to see you and hear you. And we're going to try to make sure that we get lots of opportunity for people to make this a live discussion and to have their own input. And so I will be doing my best to contain each person's single event input to about 5 minutes or less, if we can. That doesn't mean you can't speak again, but we do want it to keep flowing. So do your best to be concise with each point that you make. And then when we reach a point where the conversation has either subsided or we're at a point in time where we need to start to wrap it up, then we'll move to a motion. Along the way, it is your option always to propose a friendly amendment to the motion that is being discussed. And a friendly amendment is one that is meant to enhance the intention of or the value of that motion. Anytime somebody makes or proposes a friendly amendment, it's like proposing a revised motion. It's like a new motion, essentially. And so it requires someone to second that. And then we can resume discussion of the revised or amended motion. So that's the basic process. And then when we get to the end of that, we will call for a vote. And for voting, if you look again on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, there is a green check mark and a red X. Those are your voting tools. So you will check a green check mark if you're voting in favor of the motion, and a red X if you're voting in opposition to the motion.
Just put that screenshot up there so that folks can see just a brief tutorial. The button is located in the reaction icon on the bottom. And then you've got your raised hand, your green check, and your red X. So,
and what a handsome screenshot it is.
Hey, you know, I do what I can.
Yeah. Well, it's all about how you look, Alec. So, okay. So any questions about that, about the format and about the process? If you do, please raise your hand and we'll try to address those before we get started. Okay, then we will proceed. So we get to start off with an easy one. We have the agenda in front of us. And so I'd like to call for a motion to approve the agenda. Someone would like to make that motion?
I see Andrea making the motion, and I'm going to count Jackie as the seconder.
Done. Okay, and all in favor? Click your green button if you're in favor, the green check mark down in the reactions. And the red X in the reactions if you are opposed to this agenda. This is our practice run. Let's get it right now. It's the dress rehearsal.
I'm seeing enough green check marks to call it passed.
Okay, motion passed. And so to move on to the first item on the agenda, I'll call on April Monroe Wood, please, who will be making a motion.
Hi, everybody. I'd like to make a motion to approve the recommended private practice rate of $175, which represents a cost of living increase of 9.14% over the 2019 recommended rate.
Okay, do we have a seconder for that motion? Okay, I don't know who popped up first, but I'm seeing Natalie Brown with a green check mark. So let's count Natalie as seconding that motion. Any discussion about that? Let's go there. Again, raise your hand, use the little hand raising item here, and Alec is going to be monitoring.
Warren, is that you putting your hand up?
It is.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Warren.
it's Warren Zischerson in Cape Breton. And I had a couple of questions. That 175, is that what is recommended as a standard across the board, or is that a maximum?
No, so in 2019, a private practice committee did a deeper scan of recommended rates for psychotherapists across Nova Scotia, and determined the original rate of 165 as a recommended rate. Based on, again, the competencies and the skill sets that private practitioners are bringing forward, as well as a market evaluation as to what that hour would cost. So this is a cost of living increase, and it's a recommended rate. So what that means is that practitioners are still able to choose a rate that matches their skills and competencies and specializations in our act, and gives us the ability to set in bylaws the recommended rate that operates as a standard for what private practitioners can look to set that rate.
Okay, Alex. So is there a maximum rate that we can charge?
Again, private practitioners are private enterprises. They are able to charge what they feel they are worth. This is just the recommendation by the college for that rate.
All right. There's also the other consideration that's geographical. I've been in full-time private practice since 1978 in Cape Breton. So the rates here have always been obviously much lower than the rates in Halifax and other areas. Problem I'm seeing locally, there are people coming out of school at, I don't know, all different schools, not just social work, charging outrageous rates and just getting into the profession. So I have a concern. We are a consumer service. It has to match where we live and what people can bear financially. So that's just my input.
Thank you for that. I see that. Sorry, go for it, Todd.
Scott McGilvery's hand is up.
Thank you. I'm unable to start my video. The question I have is, when we do some private practice for child protection services, they're not paying anywhere near 175, and yet I feel in this area there's such a high demand that I need to provide the service. If not, we're going to have a ton of people without service. Just looking for some discussion or direction or comment on
that. Yes, you should be paid a much higher rate by DCS.
But that's easier said than done.
I recognize that. Again, it's our jurisdiction is laid out in that bylaw, and we can make a recommended rate. Ultimately, again, private practitioners can negotiate a rate with the service that they are taking on. For instance, I know EAPs as well don't have the same aren't able to do that in every situation. So again, it's of course is a point of contention. We of course have let DCS know what the private practice rate is. I do know that there are private practitioners who have told DCS that this is their rate and held out until that's what DCS has paid.
I would also add that it is, I know in other professions have struggled with the same concept of having a recommended rate, but then individually having to negotiate or lobby with organizations like workers' compensation and others to try to get a fair rate. And unfortunately, that is mostly left to the individual practitioners. Shauna?
Hi, sorry. Just as a question, is the college going to do any work with insurance companies based on the recommended rates? I know that we can increase the rates in that, but I know, like, for example, a lot of psychological rates are covered at full, whereas we increase our rates with insurance companies, they're not often covered with a significant copay for a lot of people. And so I didn't know if the college was going to do any like advocacy with those companies.
Yeah, so thanks for that. The Private Practice Committee did do a bunch of work on this a few years ago. We did actually sunset that committee temporarily to put together the clinical recommendations that we're going to discuss tonight, but we will bring that committee back once the clinical work is done. There is a campaign on our website right now. What I can say is that the work actually doesn't need to be done with insurance companies. Where it needs to be done is with employers and unions. It is oftentimes the employer who purchases a package from an insurance company. That is often where the work needs to be done. So there is, maybe I'll get one of my staff, perhaps Rebecca, if she can put that campaign into the chat for folks to see. But that work has been ongoing.
Thank you, Shauna, and good to see you. It's been a long time. Any other comments, questions, anything else for the discussion for this item? Okay, well, then hearing none, I would call for the vote. So if you're in favor of supporting this motion for the recommended rate, please use the green check mark, or if by chance, like someone I just saw a minute ago, you're Dana, I think it was, if if somehow that's not appearing for you, then type in the chat, type in favor or something, or opposed, and otherwise use the green and the red items.
Okay, I am seeing enough green circles to call that carried.
Right. Okay, motion carried. Let's move on to the second item. Alec is going to present the new standards of practice for regarding sexual misconduct, and but before doing that, I'll call on Jody Yurkowski Pace to make the motion.
I wonder, Jody texted me to say she was going to be late. So I'm wondering if I see Jolene. Jolene's the chair of the Board of Examiners. She's a great person to make this motion.
Okay, so I will motion to approve the new sexual misconduct policy.
Okay, and is someone going to second that?
Great. I saw April put her hand up first.
Okay.
All right, so let me review this just with folks so you know what you're voting on and how this came to be, and then we can ask for further conversations or discussions. But thanks for putting it forward as a motion. So here we go. I'll go through this as quickly but as thoroughly as I can, because this is really an important standard that we are passing tonight. Important to know, again, college's primary role is that to serve and protect the public interest. There is increasing scrutiny of all regulatory bodies and wavering public trust in many areas, particularly in areas of sexual misconduct. In health professions, where there's been major issues in Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta about the capacity of regulatory bodies to protect the public, particularly regarding sexual misconduct, where regulators have often operated in the interest of members rather than in the interest of the public. So we are being proactive and working with other regulators in the province to make sure that we have the appropriate standards to best protect the public. And that is where these are coming from. We also recognize that we have an obligation and a duty as the social work profession in Nova Scotia to ensure that our regulatory process is embedded in a trauma-informed lens to support complainants. Policy was passed earlier this year by the Board of Examiners to that effect. But we also want to make sure and are clear to both the public and members what the expectations are and what the standards are regarding sexual misconduct. So again, a bunch of work has been done around these over the last year, including consultations and a legal review and legal guidance. So again, these standards are being introduced to set these expectations for all social workers regarding sexual misconduct. It also lays out presumptive disciplinary sanctions that the college will seek upon findings and/or admission of sexual misconduct. The public has made it very clear that there is zero tolerance for sexual misconduct among health professions. And as we are always in a position of trust and in a position of authority, it is paramount that we recognize that power and that we are working in the best interest of our clients. So with that, the standards, again, are very similar to those of the nurses, doctors, and psychologists in Nova Scotia. And we are working, again, with our other health regulators to make sure that there's consistency. So standard one is that a social worker must not engage in sexual misconduct, and that a social worker must maintain therapeutic and professional boundaries with a current or former vulnerable client. And we're going to look at these terms in a minute. Always obtained informed consent prior to engaging in clinically relevant discussions of the sexual or intimate nature. Be aware of the impact of transference and countertransference, particularly around discussion of a sexual and intimate nature. The social worker is always responsible for maintaining appropriate boundaries and proper documentation of steps taken to maintain those boundaries. A social worker must not engage in any form of sexual behavior, conduct, or activity with a current client or vulnerable or former vulnerable client. Must not engage in any form of sexual behavior, conduct, or activity with an individual with whom a current client has an interdependent relationship, parent, guardian, child, spouse, parent, substitute decision maker are examples there. Must not communicate and or solicit a current or vulnerable former client through any means, including in person, in writing, or electronically, for the purposes of entering in a dating, sexual, intimate, or romantic relationship, or engaging in sexual behavior, conduct, or activity. Not use any personal or health information obtained in the context of the social worker-client relationship for the purpose of pursuing a dating, sexual, intimate, or romantic relationship or sexual encounter. Not engage in any form of sexual behavior, conduct, or activity with a former client or at least a minimum of 2 years. And after 2 years, the social worker must determine, after careful review of the former client's circumstances, that it is appropriate. So again, the Board of Examiners spent a lot of time around this particular standard and whether or not it was appropriate to put a timeline in or not. And they do so cautiously because the 2 years is consistent with other regulators across Canada. 2 years isn't really the benchmark. It is always on the social worker to assess the circumstance and the vulnerability of the client and to make an informed decision with much caution. The second standard here is that social workers must report sexual misconduct if they have any reasonable grounds to suspect that the conduct of a social worker or another regulated healthcare professional constitutes sexual misconduct. A social worker must report to the college when they have reasonable grounds to suspect that the conduct of a social worker constitutes sexual misconduct, and to the appropriate regulatory body when they have reasonable grounds to suspect that the conduct of another regulated health professional constitutes sexual misconduct. There are some definitions here, just to be clear, particularly around a vulnerable former client is an important one. A client, pretty straightforward in terms of a person receiving professional services. This does include a student being supervised by a registered social worker or a social work candidate being mentored by a registered social worker. A current client, again, is somebody who a current client is somebody who is receiving those services. To determine, a person becomes a current client when a social worker-client relationship is formed and is ongoing. To determine whether social worker-client relationships exist, consider the following factors: whether the social worker has provided social work services to the client, whether the social worker has charged or received payment from the individual or a third party on behalf of the individual for social work services provided by the social worker, whether the social worker has contributed to a social work record or file for the individual, whether the individual has consented to social work services, a service provided by the social worker, and or other factors relevant to the circumstances of the individual and the social worker. Social worker-client relationship may exist where one of the above factors is met or when a combination of factors is met. A client may be no longer considered a current client if care was provided in an episodic setting. Example, one brief intervention service, a one-time referral to a service, or a one-time visit in collaborative care practice or an urgent care setting. If the current client is an intimate romantic partner or spouse of the social worker, that person is not considered a current client for the purposes of the policy and standard. However, social workers must refrain from providing any social work services to that person. A former client, a person who ceases to be a current client and becomes a former client when the social worker-client relationship ends in accordance with the college's standards of practice. Social workers considering engaging in any sexual behavior with a former client must consider the following: ongoing risks to the former client, risk of continuing power imbalance, length of time that has passed since the last clinical professional encounter, the nature of the social work services provided, such as the type, intensity, and duration of the services, likelihood of the former client requiring services from the social worker in the future, extent of the personal health information accessible by the social worker, vulnerability of the client, maturity of the client, and the client's decision-making ability. Again, a minimum of 2 years of time must pass to lessen the vulnerability. The exact time has not been defined, as it may vary based on factors relevant to each former client's circumstances. A vulnerable former client. So a vulnerable former client is a client who is no longer a current client, but who requires practical protection for sexual misconduct for reasons on ongoing vulnerability. For some former clients, their degree of vulnerability is such that they will always be considered vulnerable former clients. This includes clients to whom a social worker has provided therapy or sex therapy. For clarity, sexual relations between a social worker and clients to whom social worker provided therapy or sexual therapy is prohibited at any time following the termination of professional relationship. To determine whether a former client is a vulnerable former client, these are some of the factors. Again, the length of intensity, the vulnerability of the client, the type of social work services. Generally, the lengthier the social work client relationship and the greater dependence, the more likely the person will be found to be vulnerable. Finally, before we get into discussion, definitions of sexual conduct, which refers to including threatened attempt or actual conduct, behavior, or words of a social worker with a sexual connotation, character, or quality. The term sexualized conduct does not include clinically indicated questions or services. Sexual misconduct includes any sexualized conduct engaged in by a social worker with a current client, including, not limited to, sexualized comments or questions by a social worker to a current client that lacks occupational relevance, including comments or questions about a client's body, clothing, or sexual history. Threatened or attempted sexual conduct by a social worker to a current client, sexual touching of any kind between a social worker and a current client, a social worker encouraging a client to engage in sexualized behavior within the social worker-client relationship, and sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is further defined as sexual intercourse, including genital to genital, genital to anal, oral to genital, or oral to anal contact, masturbation of the client by the social worker encouraging a client to masturbate in the presence or for the benefit of the social worker, or masturbation by the social worker in the presence of a client. Sexualized conduct with members of the profession and students, again, clarified here, sexualized conduct with another member of the profession or an organizational college may be considered sexual misconduct if the consequences of such conduct could have an adverse effect on a client or a working relationship. Engaging in sexualized conduct with a student that the social worker supervises or teaches is considered sexual misconduct. I'm sure there are some discussion points here, and happy to answer any questions I can.
Okay, let's open up the floor. Maybe it is pretty clear, straightforward. Anybody have any questions they want to get clarified? Any concerns? Looking at people's faces, it looks like there's fair contentment. Okay, last chance to comment. Otherwise, we'll call for the vote.
It looks like Annemieke in the chat had a question.
Thanks, Brandy. Who was it? You said Annemieke?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Annemieke, how's it
Can you
been?
explain the suggestion to obtain informed consent?
Yeah, let me just go back to that.
No.
I believe it was in relation to, again, why can't I find it now? So again, the nature of the social work services being provided, you should seek informed consent for. So if you are going to be engaging in discourse regarding a sexual nature, you should be clear. Standard 1, number 2. Thank you, Annemieke. Always obtain informed consent prior to engaging in clinically relevant discussions of a sexual or intimate nature. Again, that would be recognized, and this may be something, the standards might be a tool that you utilize there, but you do want to be able to make clear, you know, that making sure that this is what a client wants to be discussing in that therapeutic relationship, and that they're clear around those boundaries as you move through it. What is always important is the documentation from your end on what you discussed, again, what you put forward in terms of informed consent, to make sure that the client is giving that consent to move forward with discussion of an intimate nature.
So yeah, Scott was asking about written versus verbal. I would say my interpretation, Alec, would be that it's, you know, in the context of the flow of your therapeutic work, you know, stopping to get written consent for every topic it would be cumbersome. So, I mean, but it is about making sure you've documented that you had the conversation and that the client did consent of their own free will to engage in that conversation. That's the key. Whether they're signing something or not is far less important than documenting that you've had the conversation.
Yeah, you just, again, the onus on the professional boundaries is always on the social worker. So it is important to make sure that folks are aware of where the boundaries are, that the discussion is of a professional nature. And so again, as Todd said, verbal is fine. It's your documentation that's going to matter here, particularly if an issue emerges to the college. That's what the complaints committee is going to look for in an investigation.
Okay. Anybody want the last word before the vote? Warren does. Go ahead, Warren, and then we'll have the vote.
Warren, I think you're on mute if you're talking.
Warren, were you looking? Oh, there you go. You got your mic off.
There
now.
we are.
There we are.
No, I hit the wrong button initially. Sorry about that.
Okay. All right. Then let's have the vote. And so again, using the reactions button at the bottom, click the green check mark to support the motion and the red X to vote against it, or type in the chat if you don't have those buttons available. Thank you, Dana.
Okay, I am seeing enough green circles to call that carried.
Yep. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. That's really important work. I appreciate it.
Motion carried. That's a great document. So thanks to the people who put the time into that. All right, and on to the final item in our agenda, and that is the regulation of clinical social work. And so I'd like to call on Brandy Grishik. Did I pronounce that right, Brandy?
You did. Good job.
Okay, Brandy Grishik is going to make the motion then.
Okay, so a resolution of membership to further develop regulation standards and policy on clinical social work. Whereas clinical social work practice is considered advanced practice and involves individuals, families, and groups. Clinical practice situates the individual within their social context, including the family, social, economic, cultural, and political structures that affect health and well-being. Through evidence-based modalities and a focus on the social determinants of mental health, clinical social work utilizes assessments, interventions, and prevention practices through a biopsychosocial spiritual approach to help clients achieve their goals. We were looking, so clinical social work is informed by the broader concepts intrinsic to social work practice, which involve a theoretical grasp of individuals within the context of their environments, a commitment to the principles of social justice and human rights, and an orientation to client and family-centered, strength-based, goal-oriented practice. So this requires complex decision-making, systemic analysis, and advanced critical thinking skills gained through the academic education, supervised practice, continuous improvement, and focused professional development. Whereas clinical social workers engage directly with individuals, couples, families, and groups, focused on complex issues impacting on individual and family functioning and their relationships, including but not limited to mental health, addiction, trauma, grief, loss, illness, and crises. Whereas a clinical social worker will have well-developed biopsychosocial spiritual abilities and theoretical knowledge that is utilized to achieve optimum psychological and social functioning. Clinical social workers recognize that the development of an individual and their well-being is shaped across the lifespan and occur within a lived social context shaped by family, social, economic, cultural, and political factors, whereas clinical social workers recognize the profound ways in which structural and cultural inequalities contribute to the experiences of trauma, adversity, oppression, and poor health throughout the lifespan. Clinical social workers are then positioned to provide clinical social work that is holistic, contextualized, and trauma-specific, and that can define social policy measures and prevention strategies needed to support individuals in their environment, and has well-developed abilities to provide person and environment assessment, practice through a collaborative relation approach, bring a critical clinical perspective, and bring a collective and reflexive responsibility to practice. Now, therefore, be it resolved by membership. Am I supposed to read that too?
Yes.
Now, therefore, be it resolved by membership, accept the proposal on the regulation of clinical practice and move that the Nova Scotia College of Social Work Council develop the regulation, standards, and policy to strengthen clinical social work for further consideration. It's a lot of reading. I apologize for people who are visual.
Thank you, Brandy. So, Brandy has made a motion on this resolution, and so would someone like to second that?
I see Jackie
Allen. Okay, so now we're open for discussion.
Before we do that, Todd, I am just going to present again just on broad strokes of what is in that proposal. And then I do believe there is going to be a friendly amendment made to the motion. And then we'll open up for discussion. So a few steps there. Yep, so give me a minute just to review again what's in the proposal so you know what you're voting for. And then we will open it up to that friendly amendment, and then we will discuss. Thanks, folks. Okay. So I know many of you have attended the many consultations over April. Thank you so much for coming out. It really was a really great and important discussion in terms of how do we support and strengthen and grow clinical regulation. I also want to thank the clinical committee for their dedication and work towards crafting this proposal and working through tensions and complexities to arrive in this place. So let's just start again. The council tasked the clinical committee with doing this, identifying a clear scope of practice for clinical social work, examining the risks associated with the delivery of clinical social work services, examining the regulatory tools best positioned to mitigate risks, developing a rationale, recommendations, and proposed policies for the successful regulation of clinical social work. Again, two grounding documents here that went into this work. The first was the recommendations by the Private Practice Committee, which came forth in 2019, that made a recommendation that we need to move away from the regulation of private practice towards the regulation of clinical social work. That was further developed by the work of the Social Justice Committee and our partners at the Dallas School of Social Work, who produced a major research project on repositioning social work, which again interviewed and received input from over 140 social workers working in mental health, and came up with 29 recommendations to strengthen the delivery of mental health and substance use services and the role of social work within it. One of those recommendations was to create a clear scope of practice that includes critical clinical skill and family-centered practices that are grounded in a relational approach. The committee also did a literature review working off of that repositioning report. And what was consistent within the literature is what was also consistent in the feedback given in the repositioning report, which is that there is a tension that exists for social workers and a pull between traditional values of human rights and social justice and the dominance and the unquestioned homogeny of the biomedical model. Again, that tension particularly is felt within the larger systems and creates, again, a push for social workers and a challenging of those core ethics, and also challenges the care to clients. That further was explored by the committee to look at various definitions of clinical social work. Many of those definitions are found in the broader proposal. The one from Australia certainly resonated the most with the clinical committee and was utilized as a baseline to develop the scope here, which I'll go through. So Brandy read out most of this, so I'm not going to go through this first part. But again, what the core commitment here, of course, is the connection to mental health and health services through that biopsychosocial and spiritual approaches. The abilities I do want to focus on a little bit more, as there have been some core changes based on the consultation as well as a legal review, starting with this first one. So what the committee is proposing and what we're voting on tonight in terms of further expanding and creating some more details around is that clinical social workers must be able to bring a assessment through a person and environment abilities. Clinical social workers must have the abilities to complete assessments on human struggle and suffering throughout the stages of life using theories of human behavior shaped by family, social, economic, cultural, spiritual, and political structures. Clinical social workers use a person and environment lens to apply and critique a diagnosis in solidarity with clients. Clinical social workers must recognize that all individuals live in a social and relational context, and the individual is therefore always impacted and in turn impacts the social relationship and social context in which they are embedded. A critical focus, again, recognizing that central to social work practice is the pursuit of both human rights and social justice. Clinical social workers must be able to bring an understanding and a lens that is rooted in social oppression and marginalization, and being able to address those in a clinical setting. Poverty, sexism, racism, colonization, homophobia, and ableism, for instance, impact upon the psychological and social functioning throughout the lifespan. And it is essential that social workers are able to consistent with social justice commitment, considerable attention is directed to the overall social context, people's lives, including experiences of oppression, marginalizations, and violence, and the impact of power and powerlessness on lives. Clinical social workers must engage in collaborative practice where both the practitioner and the client bring knowledge to therapeutic conversations and share responsibility for the intervention to address mental health, emotional, and other behavioral issues. A collective responsibility, again, to ensure that we are creating a society that is connected around mental health and principles of social justice and human rights. And that's, again, there's a reflexive nature to the work that clinical social workers bring. A knowledge base, again, that the committee has put together absolutely includes a familiarity with social, psychological, and cultural, social, political, environmental, and health factors that influence the well-being of their clients. Again, the strength here is that clinical social workers utilize person and environment assessments while drawing on a range of other practice approaches to inform their understanding of clinical need and case formulation. There are a list of various practices. They are certainly not limited to, but a good baseline of what a clinical social worker would use in terms of an evidence-based modality. So lots of questions, lots of conflict, lots of tension around social work's relationship with the medical model and diagnosing in particular. Committee wade through this quite a bit in terms of what our relationship is as a profession to this tool, which is certainly dominant within health systems and within our society. So the committee again concluded that overall the DSM is descriptive rather than analytic. It does not always, it also does not provide treatment strategies, although they're often presumed to be medically based. It does not tend to look at the history, context, or life experiences of people. The DSM is socially constructed by the psychiatric profession and reflects the biases of the medical profession. Of course, there's a wide body of literature based on stereotypical notions of race, gender, and sexual orientation that are embedded at one point in time in the DSM and continue to have some concern there. Of course, the professional paradigm of social work, which emphasizes social context and conditions of people's lives, human strengths, and collaborative approaches, is often in contrast to that DSM and that's a medical approach. But again, given that it is the dominant tool, there is an expectation that clinical social workers have a knowledge of the DSM to be able to both apply and critique its uses. However, it remains the responsibility of clinical social workers to place and provide support for an individual in the context of their lives. So it was determined that, by the clinical committee that diagnosing should be a part of the clinical scope of practice. However, that this should never be done in isolation and always involve an assessment of the social context in order to ensure that the core scope of what social work is bringing and is there to help and support clients. In terms of the regulatory tools, so again, a legal review was conducted, and in order for this to come to life, the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers will have to seek legislative change to create a clinical scope of practice within the Social Workers Act. I'm going to come back to this legislative change as well. The other regulatory tools here would be that regulations would be set up to create a entry to practice mechanism, and that restrictions would also be placed that only those approved by the Board of Examiners would be entitled to practice clinical social workers and use that title, which would also require legislative change to be able to protect the title of registered clinical social worker. In terms of entry to practice mechanisms, the baseline is an MSW, although the proposal is that we develop a substantial equivalency for entry to practice to an MSW degree. So folks who have experience or have another degree are able to demonstrate that equivalence. It's also important to note that the committee recognized that not all MSW educations include course content work embedded in a clinical focus. Example, myself, I am an MSW educated social worker. I would have done no clinical work in my MSW. I specialized in community development. So it's important to note that there needs to be a demonstration of academic work done in the core areas of knowledge laid out in the scope of practice. Finally, again, in terms of an assessment of those core abilities, supervision was determined to be the best way to have that assessment. And so what the committee, what the proposal is that we develop, again, a process for supervision in which somebody applying to be a registered clinical social worker would need to meet certain requirements around hours and clinical supervision. And at the end of that time, a clinical supervisor would need to be able to assess that candidate has the abilities to practice as a clinical social worker. There are also a number of standards of practice to help ensure that that scope of clinical work maintains intact. So again, standards around the use of assessment. There's some examples here. But again, what is being proposed is that we create a standard of practice that would direct clinical social workers to conduct a self-assessment of knowledge, skills, values in order to utilize specific assessment tools, such as the DSM and some of these other ones as well, that the college would build a guideline toolkit to assess or to assist with that self-assessment. Professional boundaries are certainly key, as we just talked about, but again, understanding and working with the social relationships of a client is also fundamentally important. So again, there are a number of standards that are being proposed for further development, such as the acknowledgement of power within the therapeutic relationship, being able to address transference and countertransference, work with involuntary clients, priority of addressing social and relational context, consideration for when group work and supports would not be considered and when family work would not be considered. Of course, the responsibility of the clinical social work in connecting with the clients and social and relational supports. So when would that happen? What would that look like? Priority of collaborative practice. It's need to ensure that clients are actively involved in shaping assessment, intervention, and evaluation. Excuse me. Address clinical social work services with mature minors and when conducting access and custody. Again, there is an obligation for all social workers, so I imagine that this would be a standard that would apply to all members as we move forward with this process. But again, clinical social workers have the responsibility to ensure they are reflexive, to ensure they are working through an anti-racist lens. Clinical social workers have the obligation to address white supremacy in their practice, of course, the social construct in which whiteness is normalized and seen as aspirational. So it's the responsibility of clinical social workers to dismantle the architecture of racism embedded in clinical social work research and education. And it's proposed that we develop a standard to further flesh out what that would look like. Specialized practice, again, recognizing that there are various modalities, trauma-specific therapy would be one of them, that a social worker may have. Again, we would generate a standard that requires a self-assessment before listing or saying that you are a specialist in a certain area, and there would be a guideline developed to assist with that. Finally, services to clients with disabilities, which isn't prominent right now within our standards, but does need to be, particularly within clinical social work. Important to note that all Nova Scotia organizations and institutions are meant to be complying with the Accessibility Act and working towards an accessibility framework. We believe that that should apply to the college and standards as well, but particularly within practice, clinical practice, standards regarding respect for the core principles of independence, dignity, integration, and equal opportunity for clients with disabilities should be paramount. There was a need to, there are already standards regarding professional environments, particularly in private practice, but there was a need to strengthen these, in particular, clarifying and creating standards around that, particularly those in private practice, need to have clear policies regarding billing practices, cancellation, and client rights. It's proposed that the college could develop some model policies that can be used, and as well as a guideline on client rights. Documentation, other standards that need some clarity that we can flesh out and develop. Informed consent on how documentation will be utilized. Of course, that's important to note that documentation carries power and weight, and it is always the obligation of the social worker to be acknowledging that power and balancing it to ensure self-determination and the empowerment of clients. Again, there needs to be consideration on when a client would have input on documentation, a requirement of supplemental standardized assessments with contextual analysis, clarity on social workers' legal and ethical obligations when documents are subpoenaed for justice proceedings, documentations, specific standards regarding documentation in the family context, which can be quite complex, and the use of documentation when working with involuntary clients. And of course, the importance of ensuring integrity in the documentation process. I'm almost done. I promise I'll stop talking at you soon. Clinical social workers must demonstrate that reflexivity as well. So there is a proposal that we further develop a policy that would require someone registered as a registered clinical social worker to have a certain amount of supervision or consultation each year in order to renew their registration. Again, consultations were rich and lots of really powerful dialogue throughout that time. There was, and we'll find out tonight, general support for this clinical scope and the clear definition, as well as some support that this will strengthen clinical social work. course, there were many, many questions on details, particularly around grandparenting, around that entry to practice, all of which is what we're asking tonight, should we move forward to develop those. There were very serious concerns raised by Indigenous clinical social workers regarding the process of the development of this proposal. Participants strongly noted that Indigenous people in Nova Scotia have unique mental health and substance use needs, and the legacy of colonization and the continuation of colonial policies, the impact of intergenerational trauma in our systems, including social works, strongly embedded in white supremacy. Note that further engagement and consultation is needed with Indigenous communities in particular to really more clearly define what is in the best interest of Indigenous communities in terms of clinical social work. It was also strongly noted that any approach to clinical social work must include a two-eyed seeing approach. There was also many concerns raised and questions raised about the clinical supervision piece and that requirement. Questions regarding, do we have enough clinical supervisors to be able to do that assessment? How do we maintain and sustain clinical supervision? How, again, do we make sure that any new regulation we're putting in is balanced with recruitment needs of some of the larger employers? And overall, how do we support the development of good clinical social work supervision, particularly from a social justice lens, and what are the different mechanisms there? Definitely, again, at the root of many of the conversations was the initial proposal in the scope of clinical social workers using diagnostic impressions rather than diagnosing in their practice. So it was made very clear, I did hear from many participants, many of you reached out and we've had one-on-one conversations as well, that again, the lack of the legal authority for social workers to diagnose currently does impact client care. And the language of diagnostic impressions did not go far enough for those practicing clinically to meet their needs of their clients. Again, many social workers, including those on the clinical committee, indicated that it is really creates issues with access when a diagnosis might be required to access a service, or for an insurance company, or for a benefit that can be accessed through work, for a social worker not to be able to sign their name to a piece of paper, and that client having to go to another practitioner to essentially doesn't have the same relationship to essentially do that same work over again. Now, that noted throughout the consultations, and we're going to have this discussion tonight, I know it, I didn't hear, or we didn't hear anyone disagree with the assessment of the DSM and the relationship with the social work profession and the medical model. However, there was recognition that it is the dominant and that there does need to be an intersection of that good social justice, anti-oppressive practice with that medical model. So the clinical committee did make the change to look at diagnosing. That was also due in part to a legal review that was done in which, given that diagnosing is a controlled act and a review of both law and practice really demonstrated that there's not much of a difference between a diagnostic impression and diagnosing. And so the decision was made to add diagnosing to the scope of practice. Now, council did want me to make very clear that legislative change is going to be particularly challenging, and a lot of work needs to be done before we continue to pursue it. Right now, there is a project happening at the Department of Health and Wellness called Health Regulation Modernization. The project is rooted in greater government control of regulatory bodies with ministerial oversight being put into various regulation. There's also a pushing for a public interest mandate only for regulatory bodies. What that would mean for us is that we would not be legislated to do advocacy if, again, under this current environment and under what is being pressed by the Department of Health and Wellness. And in some cases, what is being proposed is an amalgamating of regulatory bodies into one authority, similar to what's been done in the UK and what's been happening in British Columbia at this point in time, which could potentially lead to a further erosion of professional identity. So there's no doubt that opening up the Act is needed. Our Act is quite dated. In 2016, efforts were made to attempt to do this, but there is risk to it, and that needs to be fully fleshed out and worked on both with members and with the public to make sure that, again, the most vulnerable that we serve are heard and have a voice. So I wanted to add that caveat as well before we enter into the discussion. Todd, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay, so let's open the floor.
So before we do that, Todd, I do have a friendly amendment that is being proposed.
Oh, yes.
So Jen, I know you put it in the chat. It looks like you just directed it to me. Do you want to put it in the chat for everyone?
Absolutely. So I just wanted to commend all the work that the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers did for consultation across the various key stakeholders in preparing and for this motion of this meeting. So the proposed friendly amendment that we just put it in writing to continue this collaboration with key stakeholders, including Black and Indigenous stakeholders, private practitioners, educators, and employers in Nova Scotia, and then just added a few more words involving the scope of practice, just to expand kind of the full scope of the practice. So I'm apologizing for adding more words in my in the proposed friendly amendment, but we were I just had great feedback about all the engagement and consultation that has been happening for this, and just to write it in to ensure that it continues to move forward in that way.
Can I ask for clarification of one point? You've got with key stakeholders, for example, Black and Indigenous stakeholders, private practitioners, and then when you get to employers, you don't say for example, and I'm wondering, do you mean NS Health and IWK and Nova Scotia government just as examples, or do you mean them as the key employers? Is that?
I would mean as examples, like I said, as the employers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So, in terms of process, what we need to discuss, and we're discussing the amendments first, then we have to vote on the amendments, and then we can come back to further discussion on the proposal. So what Jana needs right now is a seconder to the motion.
So is someone interested in seconding this amendment, the motion to amend this? Maureen Brennan, okay. And so
it's now up for discussion, and I see that Ben, so again, bear with me as we work through parliamentary procedure. Since Jana made the motion, Ben is offering, I believe, Ben, you'll have to correct me, some further language there to the amendment.
I'm not worried enough about it to make it a amendment. I was just kind of thinking out loud that that's what was meant, I think, by what Todd you clarified, right?
Yeah.
Included but not limited to. Yeah.
In terms of the employers.
Right.
Yeah. So but given that Jana did answer that question for me, we could, I'm sure, insert the language there, because that's what the intention of the motion is, right?
Okay.
The intention of the amendment. So. Okay. Right. So yes, we had Maureen was seconded that, and so let's have discussion about this. So amendment.
Just to be clear, folks, before we open up to the broader discussion around the proposal, what we have to first do is vote on a friendly amendment so that we know what motion we're discussing. So before we go into broader conversation about the proposal, which is still to happen, is there any discussion on the friendly amendment before Todd calls a vote for the amendment of the motion?
Right. So discussion on what Jana has put forward. It is pronounced Jana, is it? Not Jana, right?
Yeah, you got it correct.
Yeah, okay. So let's, okay, so Michelle.
Yeah, Ani, so I am Mi'kmaq, and I've been practicing Indigenous clinical social work, not a social worker, for the last 5 years in Ontario, and now I'm moving back to Dalhousie. My concern here, especially with number 3 or 2 in the consultation, was that Indigenous people had a great deal of concern. And you've raised the stakeholders. The first people you mentioned is Black and Indigenous stakeholders. But one, it doesn't say what the outcome, what according to the consultation, that wasn't particularly positive. So I'm wondering why you're putting that forward first. I'm also wondering who were the Indigenous stakeholders that you know, when you mentioned it first, it sounds like that, you know, that's the big people you went to, or you know, I guess I'm asking, why is it put first? And particularly, why is it negating the fact that the consultation turned out, it sounded fairly negative in terms of this? So I'm just not clear why this is being done and why Indigenous is being inserted in this way when I gather is controversial and problematic. So just wondering about that, if you could clarify.
Yeah, so let me talk first to the consultation, and then I'll let Jana speak to the motion. So the consultation was done with Alice Sudi Crisis Counseling Services, who are clinical Indigenous social workers, as a preliminary consultation. And I don't, although it does sound like the consultation was negative, there was, again, a support for moving forward with the caveat, as Jana has indicated there, that much more consultation is done with various Indigenous groups to greater, again, develop that policy and those standards to better serve Indigenous communities in Nova Scotia. So it wasn't that consultation indicated that we should stop and not move forward with this process. It was that before we finalize it, and again, the motion tonight isn't to finalize anything, it is to gain momentum and to further flesh this out and develop it, that much more in-depth consultation happen with various stakeholders that has already begun and will continue to move forward. So just to clarify the consultation.
Okay, Jana?
Thank you, Alec. I would just echo Alec's words that it's just to emphasize the continued importance of stakeholder engagement and consultation. And in terms of the order, I think that it's important to include Black and Indigenous stakeholders in the order, but it wasn't necessarily done in order for a particular reason, but just to make sure it was inclusive.
Just to let you know, actually, I'd like, if that was the only group that you consulted, I'd actually like that put in brackets, just the same way in terms of the employers and stuff. I think that's a huge gap. And actually, I'm a little concerned with what came out of it, because that's what I would call poverty porn, or what Leanne Simpson calls trauma porn, and what I think Yang and anyway, they're calling pain-based research. The other concern I have is a lot of this has to do with things like parenting assessments. And DSM is what we would, at least what I consider, negative naming ceremonies. And this has huge impacts in our families, in our communities, and on the land. And so if you're not talking to people that are actually involved in things like the protection services, which this change is going to affect protection services, we could end up being new Indian agents. And I'm really concerned if the only Indigenous connection was with the crisis counseling services and not with any of the because you've got amazing people doing work in terms of protection services. Just to give you an example. What I've been working in is child and family services. So when someone is labeled, whatever that label is, it can be just ADHD. Suddenly we aren't able to parent our own children because we're told now they're high needs. And so the foster parents are the only ones that can take care of them. And so our kids are extracted. And right now, if a lot of the stuff that's signed right now, for instance, up north, the new agreements or new treaties, if someone leaves their territory for 10 years, they are not a beneficiary anymore. They're ousted from that. That's what the government is signing. So this idea, like, what is our impact? What is the impact of using this on Indigenous communities, on Indigenous land? Does this mean that child, it took me 40 years to find, about 25, 30 years to find my own parents. I am 60 Scoop, my mother's 60 Scoop. A lot of people will not get back, and they will not get back in 10 years. So, and the problem is, if you're working private practice, you may not see that bigger picture. But I think you just heard a bit of concern, I think, in terms of the Indigenous thing. If that's just based on crisis counseling, you wouldn't imagine the concern and that would happen in terms of Indigenous protection work and stuff. And one of the things I just want to point out is you actually talk about Indigenous clinical social workers, but didn't talk about Indigenous clinical social work. And part of the cultural thing that's missing here is nothing says Western. Nothing says Western clinical social work. Nothing says a Western parenting capacity assessment. So, I have trouble with this. I have trouble. I would like, if, I don't know, can I make a friendly amendment to the friendly amendment? I think it's important to clarify that in terms of what that was one organization. And I'll get to the substance later on, but there's I think you would find there's huge concerns with this in the Indigenous community. And, one of the possibilities is just to have what we call a two-road approach. Have a Western approach, but name it that. I don't know if that makes sense. I know that my students really struggle with it. When I say, just say Western mental health. And so that allows a possibility that there's also an Indigenous mental health that may be quite different and have a different foundation. And so even the idea, like, this is all based, as you said in the stuff, it's based on the individual. Well, ours isn't based on the individual. It's based on the family and the community and the land. So what would that look like? So anyway, I have concerns with this, and especially because it's almost like it stops, putting it first almost stops, like, people say, oh, well, you've consulted. So, it'll even stop my people from saying, okay, we have problems with this, but you've already consulted with our people. And I think that I would argue that it was strategically put first. And I think we need to question why. I know you, if it was just one group that you consulted, why is that going first? Just an open question. I'm not asking for an answer. Yeah, I just want to say, what does that narrative, what does it either promote or suppress?
Yeah, thanks for that, Michelle. Again, the college is very committed, as I know you know, because you're helping us with this work, to not just doing this engagement and consultation in this area, but continuing to look at many different areas. We'll talk tomorrow too at our AGM about a further extension of that commitment and what that'll look like. In terms of the business in front of us at this moment, did you want to offer an amendment to the friendly amendment to further ensure that what you're hoping for is very clear in the motion being discussed?
I would like you to put in brackets that was one consultation with one organization, just so so our people know, hey, we can still, maybe our voice can still be heard.
So, and just to clarify, that this motion is about the forward-looking work, not about the backward-looking work. So the motion is about seeking further consultation and doing more in-depth work.
I understand that, but it also says we've already consulted. Okay, I'll have to read it again, but it's...
no, this is proposing that we move forward and include that consultation in the work moving forward.
Okay. Sorry, I was going back, trying to understand the link with the other one. Okay.
Yeah. So this motion does again give clear direction that much deeper and further consultation and engagement is required before anything else is further finalized.
Okay.
Okay. Other comments on this friendly amendment? Other discussion?
There is a question in the chat, I believe.
Sorry, will there be more consultation and approval process for the general NSCSW membership before regulation is finalized? That is what this motion is indicating. That this isn't tomorrow. Clinical regulation doesn't come online. What this motion is saying is that it basically gives the college a mandate to continue to do this work, to flush out the details, and to come back to the membership for further discussion and a final vote.
So that's a certain yes. And so let's go to Jim Morton and then Natalie Cochran after him, and then Judy.
Thank you, Todd. I'm just not totally clear about how this amendment adds to the proposal already on the table. What does it do that wasn't already there? Has anybody got a thought about that?
Jana, could you answer that as to what specifically what is added? What's the benefit to this amendment?
I guess the hope was just to clarify and have it in writing in the actual motion rather than just be implied. And I know Alec has talked about the ongoing collaborative process. So the friendly amendment is just to actually put the commitment in writing in the motion, so that so we have it as record for the process moving forward.
Jim, does that answer your question, or are you still unclear? Or?
No, I'm good with that. Thank you.
Okay. Natalie?
Sorry, just taking a bit of time to find the mute. Good to see a few folks I haven't seen in a while. So I was just reflecting upon Michelle's comments, and I was wondering, because to Jana's point, the idea is there are some fairly key groups that represent populations and employers, and the desire to be very explicit about the college's responsibility and commitment to fully engage with those groups on this work. And so I was thinking about Judge McGamock and the health directors. So thinking about the role of Judge McGamock as the Mi'kmaq Health and Wellness Authority, if that also should be a group that is specifically or explicitly stated in the amendment. So I just put that forward for consideration.
Thank you,
so, yeah, those groups were named as well by the initial engagements with some of our Indigenous practitioners, and yes, are certainly going to be part of the process moving forward. But again, I would, as Jana moved this motion, it is she can accept that as well as naming the Indigenous Health Direct. You'll have to forgive me, I forget the exact title of those groups.
It's the Mi'kmaq Health Directors and Judge McGamock.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Natalie. Let's go to Judy.
Hi, I'm just wondering, given our new legislation on accessibility and the college's focus on that, if people with disabilities has been specifically identified as a consultation group.
Yeah, so this is The answer is yes, it will be. We can name it. We can name it as well here as well.
Thank you.
Okay, and N?
So a few people have been messaging me privately as well with questions about, to follow up on the potential for an amendment to name it as Western. Some people saying that it needs to be explicitly colonizer or North American or European. But that is one. And then I also saw, first Jill mentioned to me privately and then publicly that she would like NSCSW members to be explicit in the wording to the friendly amendment. So I'm seeing several requests for friendly amendments to the wording and perhaps more clarity about the consultation process more broadly to address Judy's concern.
So, and Kayeja, you'll be next. But one thought I have is, so what we're developing now is, it appears, sort of a longer list of what we want included in this friendly amendment. And so unless we're going to get into a cascading process of many amendments to the amendment, we may want at some point soon, I'm just putting this out there for now, to have a vote on the amendment as it is now, and then continue the discussion about perhaps another amendment that seems to meet everybody's needs in the discussion. So I'll just put that out as a suggestion in terms of process. So Kayeja, it'd be great to see you. I haven't seen you since you were, well, I was going to say a little girl, but you were taller than me when you were 5. So
I know, I was just going to say that, Todd. It's been a long time, and it's nice to see you. Yeah, I don't even know if you knew. Well, we'll have to talk. I don't know if you knew I did social work, but yeah.
I did.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I just had 2 quick questions. So Alec, I just had a question for you. Within the presentation that you did, you mentioned that you consulted Indigenous communities. Did you also consult other racialized communities? I might not have heard it, but I was just curious if there was other communities other racialized communities consulted other than the one that you'd mentioned.
Yes, we did consult with Black practitioners as well, specifically.
Okay. So, and was that mentioned in your presentation though? Because
it may not have been in my presentation. It is in the broader proposal on what I heard in the consultations. It is
okay.
There.
Okay, great. Yeah. And then I guess just to the amendment, and Todd, I don't know if maybe this should come after, but I think if we are going to name Black and Indigenous stakeholders, just like we've, said a little bit of examples of the other stakeholders, I think there needs to be 2 things done. I think within the amendment, there should be some of those names mentioned so that we can understand that you're not just going to say Black and Indigenous stakeholders, and we want to make sure that you know who they are, right? And number 2, I'm just curious of the process, who is going to be accountable for making sure that they're reaching out to more than one or more than a couple stakeholders. I think that's really important when we do make this amendment, because I think respectfully, I think some folks may not know all of them. And I think it's important to hold us accountable to make sure we're doing our due diligence of doing the appropriate research, of making sure we're consulting a lot of them and we're not missing anyone. So I just wanted to share that because I just think just saying Black and Indigenous stakeholders, I think we need to be more explicit. We need to state who they are, and we also need to talk about who's going to be reaching out to the people and making sure that we're reaching out to the appropriate, and all of them, I guess. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, thanks for that. And so to Todd's point, just in terms of clarity and how we kind of parcel out the work in front of us, because there is a lot of work in front of us. And the best way to do that, and accountability is crucial. How are we accountable as an organization? Ultimately, I will be leading this. How am I accountable as an executive director? And ultimately, that accountability falls to you as membership to make sure that you are holding council accountable, who's holding me accountable. What I'd like to be maybe able to do here is ultimately what has to come, should we accept this proposal tonight, is a strategy. How are we going to do this work? What is this work going to look like? And in that broader strategy document, we can get much more specific in terms of, who we're going to engage with, by when, what that's going to look like, for membership to be able to comment on and give feedback on. It's not that I don't appreciate the wanting to name this particularly in the motion tonight. I get that. But again, just in terms of process and what might be the most effective, being able to really take that and flesh that out in more detail, I think is going to be really important. But I also recognize that, and I'm grateful to all of you, 106 of you who showed up on the nicest day of the year, to want to have input into that. And I think that is crucial. So what perhaps I am suggesting is that we look at the motion as it is, and I just added a few more things that are there. We recognize that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and that council, and Todd is the representation of council right now, is committed to making sure that a strategy is developed, put out for membership feedback, and input on in terms of who and how we are consulting.
I'll go over to N. Your hand is that still up, or no, that's a still up. Okay, that's not a new up. All right, good. So where we are now in this process is we are facing a vote on the amendment, the friendly amendment, not on the original motion, but on the friendly amendment. And then we will proceed, whether we pass or do not pass the friendly amendment. Then we'll go back to the original resolution and finish discussion on that and have a vote on that. All right. So any last comments specifically on this friendly amendment?
So this is what I have, just so folks are clear.
Yeah, no, Alec, if you're able to sort of highlight what is it that's, just so that people don't have to jump around on their screen, kind of lay out for people what's different between this and the original, just as a last reminder.
So I haven't gone back to the original, just with what Jana has put forward, but this is what I've just added to it based on that.
I put the original in the chat, Alex, if people want to have a look.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jenna. I saw that. So if everyone can take a look at the original in the chat that Jana put in there, and then take a look at what Alec has on the screen, and provide us with any comment on your on the amendment. Not on the original resolution, but the amended version.
Okay, I see Natalie has her hand up there.
Okay, Natalie, I don't see you in 20 years and now you're dominating the whole session.
Yeah, sounds about right. So I'm just curious, because I want to make sure I'm very clear. Alec, were you suggesting that instead of the proposal of accepting the work as is and moving forward, that you might put that on hold, focus in on developing the strategy that would outline how that work would go forward and then bring it back?
So I'm happy with this as it is. I mean, it's giving us a framework for which to work and what to consider. But what I was suggesting, instead of continuing to add to this very important list, that we take some time to lay out that broader strategy for membership to have input into, and then proceed with that strat. So there'd be another opportunity to make sure that we are consulting all of the parts that need to be consulted of our profession and of the people that we impact.
Yes, and I very much support the consultation. And I think it's really important to highlight some critical groups, some of whom may have not been as well consulted as others, but who are very impacted by this potential change. I guess I just want to make sure that we're not rushing through that strategy development piece and accepting the original piece of work that was presented to us earlier this evening. So that's a part I'm just trying to sort out. Yeah.
So again, the original piece of work, and we're getting into the second part, but is a proposal at this point in time. It's broad strokes. So it's not the final that's going to move forward. There's, again, the consultation that needs to happen. It's likely to change as we move through some of this towards we get to a final. The question really being asked to membership tonight is, do you as a membership want to pursue clinical regulation as something that we have in Nova Scotia as a profession in social work? This amendment or this resolution gives us a framework for which we're basing that forward momentum on. But it's not a final decision, and it's not a final, this is what clinical regulation is or what's going to be in it. It is very much broad strokes starting place. Should we get the support of membership tonight, then the next step would be to develop that strategy regarding the consultation, regarding the work, getting the details really fleshed out, and then bringing that all back for further debate and conversation to a general meeting.
So part of holding the executive accountable is that you'll be bringing the strategy back on how you're going to further consult on all the important pieces before the important pieces are decided. Is that what I heard correctly?
That's right. Now, again, we likely wouldn't hold another general meeting on the strategy. We would put the strategy out for feedback for council to pick up and take on, unless folks want us to hold a special meeting to specifically have a vote on the strategy. But that is why you elect the council to do that work on your behalf.
And I think the record of this meeting makes the interests of the membership really clear in terms of how much priority we give to sufficient, in-depth, and appropriate consultation and inclusion in the process. And so I think that's well understood and well established. So I think council has a clear mandate on that, whether we miss somebody in the list or not. I think I think that part is nice and clear. Anamika asked a question, are we voting to accept an amendment that states we accept the resolution before we actually vote? And no, what we're actually going to vote on in a second is just whether or not we accept this amendment to the resolution. That's the first thing. Do we accept Jana's amendment that we have now amended? And so we're, so I guess I would like to ask, Jana, based on what Alec has put up on the screen, are you okay with that being your friendly amendment, that revised version? Because if you are, then we can proceed without getting into amendments of amendments of amendments.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. All right. So any last comments specifically on the amendment to the resolution? Okay, so then let's have a vote on that. And so use your little green reaction or your little red reaction, or type in the chat to vote for or against the motion. And abstaining is easy because you just don't do anything. Thank you, Dana. Okay, looks like I'll give you another 5 seconds here. Anybody that hasn't yet? Looks like overwhelming support for that amendment.
We will record and make sure the no's get
Yes.
counted here as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So then the amendment is accepted. So now we go back to discussion about the overall resolution with this amendment. And so that essentially is, as Alec just paraphrased, it is basically, do we have, are you in favor of supporting us moving in this direction as per the resolution that has been read? And there's a link for it in the chat as well, I believe, for the full text of that. And so discussion about, are we interested in moving ahead with the regulation of clinical practice in accordance with the principles that have been discussed and presented? So let's talk about that. So this isn't about specific wording but if you have, if you want to get into another amendment of something, you absolutely can. But otherwise, we're just discussing the overall direction. And are you in favor of the overall resolution that we move in this direction and do this work? You can take down your little green dots now, if you'd like. And so comments, discussion. Oh, yes. Sorry, Mackenzie. I saw that question and didn't answer that. When in this process is the time to propose a friendly amendment that reg number 32 be retained as part of these aims to move towards regulation of clinical social work?
So you're going to have to clarify that for us a little bit more, but that wouldn't be a friendly amendment. That would be another motion in its entirety. And we wouldn't be able to debate that motion currently because those need to be put to everyone at least 3 weeks in advance. So if you want to can you clarify what you're talking about a little bit more? And I might be able to address it a little bit more, but I don't know that it would be a friendly amendment. I think that would be a complete changing. Well, we've already passed the amendment to that motion. So unless you're making another friendly amendment, but I'm not sure that that's what you're getting at. So sorry, Mackenzie, can you clarify?
Yeah, so Mackenzie, and then we'll go to Lexi after that. So Lexi, I do see your hand. So Mackenzie, are you able to turn on your mic and explain a bit about? Okay. Do you want to discuss it or explain it, or just hold off for now and perhaps discuss it with Alec after the fact, maybe, as to how to address your concern?
I think you're talking about the bylaws on private practice. I think that's what you're talking about. But
yes, okay.
Yeah. So again, I mean, it is part of the discussion right now. I don't think we're not ready to make a motion on that right now. That'll be part of the strategy moving forward. But part of this proposal is that we would remove the current bylaws around how we regulate private practice and replace them with, again, clinical regulation. So that is the work that needs to be done next, and we'll come back for further discussion. But that would be a specific motion about removing the current provisions of private practice regulation from the bylaws, which we're not ready to do at this point in time.
So let's go to Lexi, and then we'll go to Riley, who has typed in that they would like to share some concerns about diagnosis. So Lexi, you're on.
All right, thank you. So I guess kind of understanding that the friendly amendment, we are going to be talking to stakeholders such as Nova Scotia Health and DCS. I don't know if my question will kind of lend itself a little bit to those conversations that might be had, but I guess what I'm thinking is at present, Nova Scotia Health, for example, employs many clinical therapists, and the posting for these positions is extended to master's level social workers, psychologists, counselors, occupational therapists, and nurses even, and that these positions also are not necessarily required or is a part of their job plans to be diagnosing. So I'm curious how within the public systems, we can see these proposals as supportive and strengthening for both the profession and the public, when it seems it will only be certain members of our profession that would be exempt from applying to these positions versus other master's level clinicians. It is evident that many of these recommendations may be incredibly strengthening to social work private practice. However, in a system which is hiring individuals of equal education levels and providing additional trainings, I'm just not sure I understand, because it seems that this would only stop the social workers from being able to get those positions as they're currently posted.
So those are good concerns. I don't know if anyone wants to attempt to speculate on what an answer is, or is there an answer, or is it a more rhetorical by nature, I suppose?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to answer that for you right now, Lexi. That is part of the consultation that needs to be determined and move forward. What I can note is that the proposal here is that, again, you would need to apply to be a clinical social worker. Once you have made that application, there's a supervision period which allows you to continue to practice in that scope while you continue to demonstrate the abilities laid out in that scope. That's very similar to how psychology and counseling therapists are structured currently at this point in time. It's not a radical departure from those professions. I think we had Riley next, and then James has his
Yes,
hand.
I'm just reading N's comment here. And so before we go to Riley, so there are people still confused with where we are in the process. And so we have not given a green light to moving forward with regulating clinical practice. That's the part we are discussing now, and then we will vote as to whether we want to move forward with that in that direction or not. Just so you know. And so, yes, who did I say was next? Riley, yes. So Riley, do you want to share your concerns, and then we'll go to James? Your concerns regarding diagnosis?
Yeah, are you able to hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, I just have a funny headphone setup that I'm not used to. Thanks. Yeah, I have a few concerns about diagnosis that actually I didn't think about at first. When I first heard it, I just didn't think much of it. And then I've been giving it a lot of thought. And I even found Michelle, who spoke at the beginning, I found her concerns to be really important, and also some things that I hadn't even thought about. So I'd want us to think more about that in relation to the diagnosis piece too. But a few of the concerns that came to mind for me are that it kind of expands the scope of social workers and demands without necessarily increasing compensation. So I'm not really thinking about private practitioners. I'm more thinking about, because for private practitioners, I can see some like value, I guess, in adding abilities that you can do, but kind of for the rest of us or for other situations, adding this to legislation, it kind of sounds like, and I think that it's a choice. And I think if it's in our legislation, then employers and governments could ask us to diagnose, and then it would no longer be necessarily a choice for us. And I think that's a fear for just adding that responsibility. And it sounds like it would be offering kind of cheap labor for governments in a way, where psychiatry and psychology cost more. And I mean, it's part of it is, yes, it might increase access for folks, which I think is valuable, but kind of like at what cost to us and to kind of the system. It feels like we're a little bit giving into or like supporting the medical model. I think if we legislate this, even though the wording is kind of funny and says apply and critique, I think that really muddies the water. We are adding, like the way it's being proposed is we are adding diagnosing using the DSM. So I think saying, kind of having it in that, written in that way is a little bit confusing, but if it is like that, I think that's a fear. And I think it's also, I feel like we're inadequately trained to diagnose. It's not part of most social work schools to teach you how to diagnose. I know for me, I learned a lot about critiquing the DSM in my studies, but not necessarily how to use it and apply it. So I think it would require a lot of additional training. And I think I've seen psychologists and psychiatrists in their residencies and training and how intensive that is, and how they often have like 60+ hour work weeks of intensive supervision, and it takes them years to learn how to apply and use the full DSM in that way. So I think, I don't know if I'm being totally clear here. I think these are just a lot of concerns that came up for me when I've been thinking about that. And I'd be curious to hear what other folks think. And then, I think it's just a lot of the focus of social work. And I think about our upcoming conference on transformational change and social justice and all these directions that we want to be heading and greater advocacy. And I think this piece kind of further fits us into this medical model that I know we have to like work in our jobs often anyway, but I think that I would rather us do more work to dismantle or advocate for clients and folks who need that versus kind of squeeze ourselves in to fit better within it and provide that kind of easier access to diagnosis so that employers can be like, this is better, this is easier. I don't know. I know it would help some individuals, but I fear that it would be a Band-Aid solution that would then remove the efforts or the need for government to be creative and actually come up with long-term lasting solutions that are a better fit for people. But yeah, I hope that was somewhat articulate, but thanks folks. I will end.
Thank you, Riley. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go to James Dubé.
Hi there. So I'm a clinician who works, I guess, primarily with justice and with the courts, but in the community. And we also work a lot with health, and we do a lot of mental health work from a forensic lens. And in that setting, in those settings, it really matters who has the authority to be saying what they're saying. The DSM was written with social workers in mind, or named by the association that produces it. And there's many of us that are doing it. We're using the DSM every day. And really what the pushback, and the reason that I've been kind of advocating for its inclusion, is because it's one tool and it's something we're already having to do, and we're butting heads with people trying to do it. And I think that having the governing body that kind of tells us what we can and can't do, supporting our work is pretty essential for us moving forward. And, as professionals, I think that many of the critiques that are launched against the DSM are actually critiques about practice and how the DSM is used. I'm all for critiquing psychiatry and different medical models and practitioners, and I am an AOP person at heart. That was my training. But I was also taught that it's really hard to critique the DSM without using it and without having the authority to use it. So if I go in and I try to critique a doctor's diagnosis as it currently sits, it's, well, who are you? Right, in court or elsewhere. And, I worked on the insides of hospitals and different things like that, where social workers are kind of participating in that work already, but there's a hierarchy. So, if we're already doing all the work associated with it and we have the most powerful lens to critique it, why not just give us the authority to be using it and to be the one signing off on it, right? Nobody should really be diagnosing alone anyway. And I think that this is just like any other part of the clinical scope, and that you'll do it if you're good at it, and if you want to do it, and if you want to get trained. And if you don't want to, you don't have to. I don't do a lot of the things on that list. Some of them I've never heard of, right? And I don't practice using those techniques, right? But and it's always interesting to me that this is the one tool that we get stuck on, right? There's a lot of things listed there that we're not debating. And really, I think that what I would like to see is that my governing body is not tying my hands in many settings that I work, and giving me the option to use this tool if I so choose, and if I want to go and get trained on it, right? And it is a very powerful place to advocate from, right? If you can educate a client about the DSM and the problems with it, and in the courts, and then you testify and you answer all the questions from all the lawyers, right? That's a pretty good locus of advocacy right there. So I would love to see that included.
Thank you, James. And over to Kim Blackbeard. I feel like a radio talk show host.
Hi, and thanks so much. I really appreciate the dialogue and what James just said. I have been a clinical social worker for about 25 years and worked within mental health and addictions. And at one point, even had the opportunity with my psychology colleague to teach, was trained and taught the use of the DSM, because we went in when I started my career, we very much worked within a system where we had to put a diagnostic impression when we worked with clients. I've definitely seen the importance and the value to a client to know the diagnosis, to understand the diagnosis, to sit with someone from a social work perspective and look at what that means, and how important I feel that our profession is able to weigh in on this piece and be seen as an equal partner in the diagnostic process, because I've worked with psychiatry, psychology, and certainly I felt what I've brought with my diagnostic impression has really helped inform the final diagnostic given to a youth. I did a lot of work in autism, and a lot of my role was just to sit with the families and help them understand what this means, that it's still the same child they had a week ago before the diagnostic was given, but the diagnostic helps guide the treatment. And I just think for the growth and development of our profession that we need that professional legislation to say, yes, we can diagnose, because there are social workers in our field with great expertise, and yet we have to defer to other professions to make the diagnosis when we in fact have such a strong sense of what is happening with the family and what the diagnosis should be. So I really support us moving forward and looking at how our profession can become part of this whole system that is, in many ways driven by the medical model. And as social workers, our prime mandate is to work within the model and for change and how we look at these things. So yes, I fully support us moving ahead with this piece. And thanks.
Thank you, Kim. And over to Katrina Brown.
Hi. Well, that came up quickly. I wasn't expecting that. I'll just try to be brief because I could go on ad infinitum on this issue. Let me just say, first of all, I want to address the idea that there's one notion of Western mental health. There is mainstream Western mental health, which does tend to be pathologizing, individualizing, and very diagnosis focused. There's no social context. There's no real visible social work focus. There's no attention to context, to diversity, and so on. But there are many of us who've been very actively involved in trying to critique that particular system. And one of those things has involved, and I'm one of those people who've done it, is to critique the DSM and the use of diagnosis. Why do we need to do it? How often do we do it? I'm a private practitioner. I never do it. I never use it. I know what it is. I can critique it. I can see it. I think there are some instances where it's useful and psychiatrists can go ahead and do it, but I'm not sure that we need to do it. I think that, the report being referred to by Alec, the repositioning report, I was the lead researcher on that. And overwhelmingly, the social workers who participated were opposed to the use of the DSM. And they were opposed in part because of the implicit devaluation of the actual lens that social workers use, one, and two, the sort of assumption that the paradigm of a medical model was the best model, and the way in which social workers get co-opted into that one way or another. We end up ambivalent often in that co-optation. So I worry about the slippery slope. I understand all the sort of stuff about wanting to be a team player and wanting to make things better in terms of access to things like insurance. But we already are facing this really heightened lack of resources, wait lists, lack of lengthy consultations, 6 to 8 sessions per individual, if after they wait for a year to get in, and that's only when they are a tier 1 in Nova Scotia diagnosis. So we're already in a crisis state in terms of the delivery of services. It's actually a crisis. And social workers, what we have to offer in all of that is, you know, a focus on what's really going on in people's lives. What does it mean? How can we be of assistance? How can we get resources? How can we include things about community? How can we develop alternative kind of services? How can we have a relationship with clients that's supportive and helpful? Those kinds of things are really important to our training. We need to think about, how are we different? What are our values? What makes us different? What do we love about social work? What do we bring that other professions don't? We bring a social justice lens. We're the only one that does. We're the only one that does. And what does that mean? It means that we're always concerned about that individual in the social context, which supports a lot of what Michelle was saying earlier on. And so when we start going down the slippery slope of participating in diagnosis, because it makes us feel like we know something, it makes us legitimate because we're playing in that game, I think we're selling ourselves out. That's what I think we're doing. I don't think we need it. And I think that somehow we've been convinced that in order to be valued, and it's true, we are devalued, in order to be recognized, and it's true, we're not recognized sufficiently, that what we need to do is play the game the way the big boys are playing it. And I'm not sure that's actually the solution. Now I see that maybe right now there's sort of an effort to tweak what's going on in order to be able to address some of these really critical, immediate kinds of issues like services in rural communities. But I think in the long term, we are really going to pay the consequences of buying into that idea that this is what's important for us to move forward. I think we're far better off fighting against the fact that there's not enough money in mental health, get our politicians to develop more services in the community, developed by the community, consulting with communities. All of that is way more important. And what we know about the social determinants of mental health is that actually things like poverty and racism and sexualized violence are the primary causes of mental health problems. And you don't need a diagnosis for that stuff. You need to go out and change those things. So that's my passionate sort of position on this. And I'm tucking it in. That's me tucked in for today.
Thank you, Katrina.
Thanks.
Now over to Connor Ryan.
I'm afraid I'm forced to disagree with Katrina, to be perfectly honest. I think she's proceeding from a lot of false assumptions of where us as clinical social workers are coming from. I have found in some cases that I have seen, I believe that, first of all, I will say that I believe it is a key part of social work to critique aspects of the DSM. However, I also perceive that I have seen times where a diagnosis is actually very empowering for clients. I think of situations such as bipolar disorder, where people finally can make meaning to their lives and what is occurring in their lives. I think things like the autism spectrum, where it makes sense for people to have an understanding of what they're struggling with and how empowering that is for them as clients. So I think we're missing part of this argument, and I guess that's all I need to say.
Thank you, Connor. And Alex Earl Lambert. And Connor and Katrina, if you can take down your hands, that would be great.
Hi, I hope you guys hear me, I'm mobile and that wouldn't have been my choice, but I'm also going to have to respectfully disagree with a number of points that Katrina made, primarily because I think it's a reductive look about the social work function in mental health as it currently stands. In no way do I feel devalued in my role as a practitioner, either in private practice or in public mental health. What I do see as problematic is that I wouldn't say I'm performing the same job, because I'm not. We're social workers, that's different. I look from a different lens. I consider the client in their lived experience. I consider how their upbringing, colonialism, all of these things impacted their lived experience. What that doesn't change about the use of diagnostics in mental health is that getting diagnosis as it stands, whether that's problematic or not, provides access to resources like funds, like supports in post-secondary, like supports in elementary and secondary school. And I think, for one, the other resources that provide those are limited, if not non-existent, in Nova Scotia. And two, having social workers enabled to, I think it was stated, like play in that sandbox or whatever it would be, means we're looking at that with a diagnostic lens and the capacity to be respected in that role. Because regardless of whether or not someone's lived experience contributes to their having ADHD, their access to supports for youth with ADHD contribute very well to their being able to live a more fruitful, productive, happy, contented, less likely to further be oppressed by all of the things that we're also trying to fight, as well as getting access to things like medication with physicians. So in as much as I recognize that utilizing exclusively the DSM, which I will say I don't think happens necessarily by psychologists or social workers who I regularly work with, I do think that being able to engage with the materials that are generally recognized to be core components of clinical work is necessary. And I think it's kind of overdue that we're simply trying to engage in that practice now. So that's me. I'll shut up.
Thank you, Alex. And Sarah O'Halloran, sorry.
Hi, yeah, I have a question. I'm coming from a Nova Scotia Health and IWK perspective, and so they are a large employer of BSWs as well as MSWs. So what I have kind of yet to learn so far is how, if anyone's really, I guess, considered the impacts to BSW level social workers who will not be grandfathered in, who would technically fit within this role of doing some of this clinical work like assessments, and how you see that impacting these roles, or how, if there's been any discussion about if there'll be changes in that way to these roles and their qualifications.
I can speak to that a little bit, Todd. Yeah, thanks for that. In terms of what's in the proposal, is currently there is a proposal around grandparenting that needs to be carefully considered in terms of who's doing clinical work at this moment in time, because of course the intent, ultimately why we're bringing a motion like this to membership is that it is about your rights to work in particular scopes of practice. So it's important that we gauge very carefully and considerately about that. And so within the grandparenting provision, that is some of the work that needs to be done around who needs to be grandparented in. The other consideration as well is, as part of the proposal, is measures to create substantial equivalencies, so that the MSW is being set as the bench line to entry, but recognizing that there are multiple ways to learn and grow as a professional outside of just academic learning at a graduate level. So the intent of this proposal is that we would develop a process for somebody with a BSW education who has been practicing for, in a certain area for a certain amount of time with a certain amount of experience to be able to be apply and be registered as a clinical social worker. So that is part of the consideration within this proposal.
And Alec, if I may, we also tossed around the idea of 2 different designations for BSW people. So we haven't really got that far yet, right?
That's
so
right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Alec and James. And now, Alex, can you take down your hand? And then Brandy, you're on.
Great. I just wanted to speak towards some of the the concern and the worry I've heard today, and I think at other moments during our discussions about people diagnosing out of their capacity, and that this will put people in positions to diagnose outside of their capacity in the DSM. And so I don't think as a committee, as far as I know, we've really gotten to a point where we really understand the full amount of responsibility that would necessarily entail. And on a different side of it, if you think about any other profession, or you talk to any other profession, very similar to what Riley had said, there is an expectation of being competent, which comes above and beyond what you're allowed to do under the law. So for people who are able to diagnose for autism, for example, they have extensive training and understanding of what that looks like, using tools, etc. And for us as clinicians, if we did get to a point of diagnosis, there would absolutely still be a discussion about how do we prepare our social workers to be able to do this confidently, and not putting people into positions where they are forced to do something they don't feel competent to do. And that's really, I think, Alec, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but that's really the reason we're here today, is to talk about that clinical social work designation, what that entails. And then the other piece I have to say about this is a big piece of it is protection of public. And so there are social workers who are very new, who maybe don't understand the DSM in such depth, or understand diagnosis in such depth. And to protect the public, it's really, I think, necessary to have a designation so that people aren't doing things outside of their scope, thinking that they might have the education and knowledge to do so. And then the public is also aware of what skills they can expect from a social worker who is clinically designated versus not. I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Brandy. There are no hands up except for Brandy's at the moment. Anybody else want to weigh in? I see there have been some comments in the chat. I can't read them all, but I assume many of you have been following some of those. Anyone else want to make a comment, express an opinion? It's a nice straightforward issue, at least, right? So
no complexity at all. There never is in social work practice.
No, that's exactly right.
I'm on my phone, so I don't know how to put my hand up. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that I work in public mental health, and so I'm, not in favor of the DSM, but in favor of our option to have the option of diagnosing. But just one advantage that maybe hasn't come up, which no doubt some folks will dispute, but that for some people, medication is helpful in mental health. It's not the full answer. It's not a panacea, but for some people in primary care, we have a lot of folks.
Sorry, Ben, we are not having the best reception from you. I don't know if you can move. I think you might have moved to your phone. I don't know if you can move to a better place. But
voice is coming in and out a bit. We're not getting anything from you now, Ben. Okay, so Ben, we're going to move over to Serena for a minute, and maybe, and then we'll come back to you in a minute if maybe you'll end up in a better place because we've lost you completely. Serena?
Hi there, thank you. There's certainly a lot to take in this. I appreciate the dialogue. Seems like we're constantly kind of looking at our identity and challenging that, which I think is really important. I do think, and certainly don't want to come across as a broken record, but this province is undergoing our biggest public inquiry with all eyes on us right now for recommendations. I've been working along with the social directors and really looking at what these recommendations are going to look like. I think it's a time that we're at a big crossroads, and I think how we really look at trauma and how we're kind of looking at that perspective from a mental health angle, but also as a proactive preventative strategy. I think those are really important things to be thinking about in the crux of these discussions as well. We do have a lot of eyes on our province right now, right across the country. And I think this is a time social work in itself. I think some of these decisions do reflect on where we're going to go with this. And is this about individual practice? Is this about how we're trying to shape community and becoming more of a proactive discussion on how we're going to elevate all of this? So I have found that to be very, very difficult and kind of trying to figure out where we stand in this. And I can tell you that there will be heaps and heaps of people diagnosed with PTSD if we continue to look at it from that lens only, rather than trying to elevate and look at a social justice lens, again, around intergenerational trauma and those kinds of perspectives. So I can see both sides of this. I can see much of this, but I also see that there's a big opportunity right now for us to be more progressive in a social justice lens around what trauma and grief and where and how, and what are we going to do with that in the future.
Thank you, Serena. There's one comment here, and Alec, I might just want to get you to comment for a minute. A comment from Rose Scott Lincourt that I just, for clarity, so one of the things she's saying is that, you know, DSM has its place and it has some value, but that doesn't mean that a social worker needs to be diagnosing. And for clarity, this moving in this direction will not require any social worker or even any clinical social worker to be diagnosing, correct? It will just allow for that within their scope of practice by legislation.
That's right. And again, I'll put that's right with the caveat that Lexi brought us at the beginning. But like any scope of practice, and ours is a monster truck as it is, we don't all practice within every single element of it.
Yeah.
You know, I practice at a macro level, other people practice at a micro level. It doesn't define how you practice. There's a scope of practice and a scope of employment. Yeah. And so the scope of employment is not within our jurisdiction. That rests with the people who employ you. So again, that's the distinction here, is that we are opening it up so that there is more avenues that you can go down. But to Lexi's point, again, this does mean that employers can say, we require you to do this as part of your scope of employment, and that the legal, again, mechanisms for you to be able to do that, we would be working to remove so that you could do that diagnosis if you chose to, or if your work required you to.
Right. So this is more about allowing the scope of practice to include diagnosis, to include using DSM. But again, there's no mandate for any of that. There's no requirement for anyone. So I'm not taking a position. I'm just trying to clarify that this does not require anyone to use DSM or to do diagnoses. It just potentially allows it to be in your scope of practice. And then the rest is between, potentially, as Alex said, between any individual and their employer, or potentially their union. You know, that's a whole other issue around how that gets managed. So I'm going to go to Andrea Hickman.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. I just wanted to add one thing as I was kind of listening to the dialogue, which I think is so important. But for one thing that stands out for me is if I reflect on my work that I did with readiness assessments for the trans health community. And I remember coming to a point where I really worried that our social work lens was going to be removed from the table, because the endocrinology guidelines in Canada required a diagnosis rightfully or wrongfully, to be included in the assessment for access. And it was social workers' assessments that were being valued and looked to, which were very comprehensive. They were deep. They have the social justice lens embedded. And because parts of our country, social workers in certain provinces can diagnose, and it wasn't realized that in Nova Scotia, our social workers could not. And we faced the fact that could we continue to be at the table? And that was kind of a scary reality that that we could have been left with social workers not being able to do this type of work that I think that we are, if I can humbly say, best suited for than other professions. And they agreed at the time that they would go forward with our impression at that time. But I do worry that if we don't add this skill set to our tool belt, so to speak, and something that we are considered and learn how to deeply use as part of our work, I would worry that we would lose our opportunity to keep social justice on the table. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Thank you, Andrea. Brittany Eisner.
I just have a clarifying point. If we're accepting this proposal, is that inclusive of, yes, we are going ahead pursuing widening the scope to diagnosing, or is that still part of the conversation around what this looks like? Because it sounds like there's still a lot of differing views to the point that I'm not even sure how I feel about it, because there's lots of good points being raised on either side. So is saying yes to this proposal mean, yes, this will happen in our clinical scope, or that there's going to be more consultation and discussion to be done?
Yeah, thanks for that. So in terms of process, there are a couple of hurdles to jump over, to move through, or to move around. Again, there's, we've outlined in this motion a broad consultation process that needs to occur to really define the specifics, do some more analysis on impact, and bring that back for further consideration. But at the end of the day, the reality is a decision to expand our scope of practice doesn't actually rest with us, unfortunately. We make an application to the government of Nova Scotia, and ultimately the government of Nova Scotia, our elected officials, have to amend the legislation. It has to go through a whole process to amend our legislation to get to that point. So we could make an application, and the government of Nova Scotia could say no. They've done that to us before. So the reality is that what this motion is to continue to pursue the development of clinical regulation, to develop the specifics for further assessment and analysis by membership, and then to figure out what steps we need to go through to get there. Now, again, there are some things that if we do adopt tonight that we can move forward with more quickly after we've done more consultations that are within our jurisdiction to do already, such as standards. We can create those, and looking at our bylaws currently. But again, that, as we've outlined, there's a bunch of steps that we want, that members are looking for before we make that final decision. Again, this was an opportunity tonight, and we're still having that opportunity to test and to put forward, is this what we as a profession want? Do we believe that this is in the best interest of the public to do? Gauging again, because as I mentioned, this is a change that impacts your right to work. So we have to, again, make sure that we're taking due consideration in that. So it's not a done deal. The conversation doesn't end tonight. Tomorrow, if this vote passes, clinical regulation doesn't come online, but it does give council a strong mandate to be able to continue to pursue this. And if the vote is defeated, then it also gives council direction on where to go and where we might need to go next in terms of strengthening clinical social work. Because as I mentioned in the consultations, that we did, regulation is but one piece of what we believe we need to do to strengthen social work in this province. There's a ton of advocacy. There's political work that needs to be done, more engagement, promotion. All of this stuff is underway and continuing, and we hope that efforts have an impact, but this is just one piece.
Hopefully that helps to clarify. Thank you, Alec. Ben is back.
Yeah, I didn't realize that I'd cut out. I went out to my barbecue because, of course, it's really warm when there's chicken on the grill. So I'll be quick.
Yeah, you had to go and do that. Come on.
Yeah, I had to. So my point was just that maybe one of the benefits of being able to diagnose would be able to work with GPs and nurse practitioners who are reluctant to prescribe mental health medications. Just might help us to work more closely with community primary care providers, because for some people, medication is a helpful part of their recovery. And the other thing I just wanted to add is, like many of us, I was trained at a critical school. I did both my social work degrees at Dow and spent a lot of time there. And one of the things that I learned there was to take this both and perspective. And it really feels like part of what the debate that we're having here is an either or sort of debate. And I think that they sort of like, we can both do it and not do it, and do it where it's appropriate and do it critically. Like for me, I think that that's actually having the ability to diagnose is a potential role for a critical social worker. I don't think the two are incompatible at all. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. I'm glad you're able to rejoin us, even though you teased us with the word barbecue. So we don't want to hear any more from you today. Thank you very much.
Sorry, and sorry, Todd, I just want to come back to process, because Jolene raised a crucial point that I missed as well, is that the other hurdle that we have to move through, should this be accepted, is that because diagnosing is a controlled act in Nova Scotia, we do have to gain some kind of consent from both the physicians and the psychologists who have that in their act right now. That wasn't necessarily a political fight that I wanted to have, but if direction is given from membership, I'm happy to take that on.
Yes. And Jolene noted that in her comment as well. So that's great. Ben, I think your hand is still up. I don't think it's up a second time, since I told you we didn't want to hear from the barbecuer anymore. Thank you. Okay. Who else has a thought, a comment, want to weigh in? Any concerns, any issues that we perhaps have not heard yet that people really should consider before voting on this? Any unique perspectives we've missed? That's the most important part of this part of the process, is to make sure that all individual unique kinds of perspectives are out there for people to consider. And we have Vicky.
Hi there, sorry, I'm joining late, so this might have already been discussed, but I myself recently moved back home from Alberta, and just with the current kind of state of social workers, especially in Cape Breton, the complete lack of them, I'm just thinking that this proposal can maybe attract some social workers from other provinces and make us kind of more competitive to bringing social workers to Nova Scotia. So I don't know if that was previously discussed, but I feel like that's kind of a bonus in bringing this to the table.
Great, thank you.
So Norma just asked some questions there. Is that no, this proposal is that clinical social work, regardless of working in private or the public system, would be regulated. And we are saying that entry to that clinical designation is through an MSW with a substantial equivalency program being created to ensure that there are other pathways.
Yeah, so it's got nothing to do with where your employment is. This is about the type of practice, not about the actual position you hold in private or public. Lexi?
I guess just to build upon what the last individual said, as well as Ben earlier, I think sometimes we're taking on a bit of an either or approach. And it's important to keep in mind we all have our own opinions, obviously, on the topic, but really thinking about the profession as a whole and what this is going to mean for individuals entering the practice, for our hiring, and hiring in terms of them being able to support the populations that we need to serve. And you know, how large that need is across the province. So kind of keeping in mind the bigger picture as well, and not only, you know, what our desires for our own individual practice may be.
Great refocusing of perspective, Lexi, to add on to the previous comment. Thank you for that. Any last comments? I'm going to kind of, we're slowing down, and I see Rose has to leave. We've had a few more people leave as well. I don't want to prematurely end the conversation, but I think we're slowing down in terms of reaching the end of the perhaps unique pieces of information to consider. So any last? Well, I think then let's go to a vote. And so we have a resolution on the table that has been moved and seconded. It is, you have the details in terms of what it says, but the concept, as we've clarified a couple times, is that we move ahead toward regulating clinical practice, and that will involve a ton of targeted consultation, opportunities for the membership to have input. It will involve discussions with government, absolutely, because they're the ones ultimately who will make some of these decisions, the ones that involve legislation. Just for clarity, it's not intended to restrict or to force someone to engage in a particular type of practice, but more to define the scope of practice for what clinical social work is, and to regulate it to meet our public protection mandate. So it's a combination of purposes. Let's have the vote then. So green to approve moving ahead with this, moving ahead with the process, essentially, because you're not approving a specific end result at this point. It's approving moving ahead with the process. And red to oppose it. We'll wait for a minute to give everybody lots of time, because there's been certainly, oh yes, and the comments, use the comments if you don't have the red or green. And please leave, after you have put your vote in, please leave it on the screen for a minute, because it may take a minute in this case for those to be counted accurately. So if you have not voted yet, please do so now before the counting starts.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify that, because obviously there's a lot of confusion, and like I've been to a lot of the meetings about this policy, of course, but I'm just curious. So if we don't vote to move forward with this, then we would just stick with the old school private practice.
What it would mean is that we would come back as leadership, Jolene, and figure out what we want to propose next.
Okay. Cool. Okay. Good to know.
So if that changed anybody's votes, please make that shift right now.
Okay.
And so
14, 15. I have 16 no's. I'm wondering if any of my staff want to help me verify that. And I see you there.
I see 16 as well. I was kind of going through the participants list.
So that would carry then.
Okay. So, yeah. So unless there's anybody, if there's any of you who have not voted and so we're not counted, then you're going to have to actually verbally speak up, orally speak up, I should say. All right. Then the resolution has been carried, has been approved. Thank you all, because that brings us to the end, despite the fact that I know that many of you are probably really sad now that it's over and you get to, or you have to go back to your regular life for the evening, because your day probably wasn't long enough so far. Thank you all very much. This has been a really good debate, discussion, lots of really valuable input that will absolutely be incredibly useful for council and executive moving forward in terms of making sure that we account for the important views that have been raised here. And so it is not too late to register for the conference that is tomorrow and Saturday. So if you have not done that and you're able to attend for all or part of it, please register. The link is on the website, so it's easy to find. And remember that the AGM is on Saturday morning. So if you can attend that, again, you can find that online as well to register for it. And Rebecca has just sent the link. So, so please attend what you can of the conference and the AGM. And hopefully we will see you over the next day or two. Thank you again.